So today's goal is to show you how to get information out of Microsoft Flight Simulator. It'll be a pretty generic conversation, which is useful for most any app that you might use to interact with Microsoft Flight Simulator. But I'll focus in particular on the app called Axis and O's. There's another app called SPAD Next that has a lot of support from a man named Les O'Reilly, and he's got a ton of videos there. So I just saw that there's not as much information out there for Axis and O's, and so I thought I would make a video series for that. I've only been using Microsoft Flight Simulator since about January, so I don't have a deep history with Microsoft Flight Simulator, and some of that might show, and if I make any mistakes, just feel free to correct me in the comments below. You might ask, why do we use these other apps instead of just using what you do inside of Microsoft Flight Simulator? And the answer is there's at least three different reasons that I can think of. The first is that for any reasonable, complicated setup that you might have, like in my case, I have a full F-18 cockpit that I've built. It just gets frustrating. It can't handle the number of devices and different airplanes and all of that kind of stuff. Things get really overlapped and confused. And so it's just, I've found that pulling that out of the simulator gives us more efficiency and kind of like fine control for when you do have a more complicated setup. Another reason is that a lot of what's in an airplane may not even exist to be bound inside that airplane. For example, we'll look at this panel light knob. This does exist to be bound, but this here, the lock pin for the yoke, it might not. And so if you want to keybind, removing that so you don't have to always reach in here and just click on it, then finding that item within the default bindings window might be a problem. So let's look at, go to settings and in controls, wait for it to load. And now we'll type panel. And when we do that, we can see there's an on, there's an off, there's a set lights, but it just says it's going to be on or off. And then there's a set lights power setting, which you would expect an increase or a decrease. This is just a single button bind. So as to how that works is interesting. But this will turn on and off the lights. If we were to look for the yoke lock, nothing even comes up. It's blank. So that one doesn't seem to be available, at least under the name yoke. You could start, trying to guess, well, maybe it's pin, like a yoke pin or something like that. And then it just says, gives up, I guess. I don't know. I don't see any option there. So, yeah, banner pole, who knows? So, I've just found it so frustrating to use the in-game one that using an outside app has been a lot more useful for me, especially for the setup that I have. So the next thing that we need to talk about is you do need to have some understanding of what you're going to be looking for. And I'll talk about how to look for stuff in a second, but let's say, what are we going to look for to begin with? So there are a number of different things in Microsoft Flight Simulator that change the behavior of the aircraft. There's first, you have these things called events. There's K events, and then there's these IE events or input events. K events are called key events, and they're used to manipulate things in the airplane. It's a generic list. You can go to the SDK for Microsoft Flight Simulator. There's a website for it. And in that, there's a thing called event IDs, and you can find all of these different K events that exist for an airplane. The issue is there's a billion of them, and most of them aren't used by every single plane. So digging through this isn't terribly useful in my view. The IE, the input event, you'll use this one a lot too. Input events are generally connected to what's called a B variable, which changes something in the airplane in terms of animation, interaction, or making things happen. The landing gear is a good example. In order to find this event in Axis and O's, if you have Axis and O's installed, you could just go hit the plus to add a bind, click on key down event, and it brings up this window. So those Microsoft input events are this fourth item here, and there's a lot of them. We could search for landing gear and then apply that, and we will see landing gear IE. We see a duplicate of it up here. You see that there's landing gear lights, taxi lights. So this landing gear, you will notice that the IE connects to these things called B variables, and they have different names like increase, decrease, and toggle. If we were to look at, this is the landing gear down here to the lower right. Let me hide let me see if I can hide the yokes here. Get that hidden. All right. So there's the landing gear. So in Axis and O's, when you're looking at these events, you can test them with values. Generally 0 and 1 are useful. So if we have this selected, the input event, and we test it with 1, we don't see anything happen. If we test it with 0, we see that the landing gear moved up. So the 0 is up and 1 is down. So that's useful. I now know if I set that IE to 0, it'll go up, and if I set it to 1, it'll go down. If we look at increase and I test it with 1, it goes up. If I test it with 0, it stays put. If I test it with 1 again, it doesn't do anything. And so you can see increase is kind of like move the landing gear up. The opposite is true for decrease. If I test it with 1, it goes down. 1 is generally true in kind of computer logic, so you can kind of think of it as make the decrease event true, which means move it down. If I set it to 0, it doesn't do anything. The toggle B event, if I set it to 1, it just bounces it between the two, which can be useful depending on the kind of input that you have. Setting it to 0 also bounces it between the two. So it doesn't matter whether you make it a 0 or a 1, toggle will move it to the other side. And then gear set acts like the IE, where 0 moves it up, 1 moves it down. So we can see that we have these variables that are connected to an event. In general, I find the B variables the most useful because they have names as to what they do, and it makes a lot of sense as it relates to the sim. But you could use either one of these, and you're going to see this theme of there's multiple ways to do this throughout these videos and just this video alone. So let's go back and talk about our events again. So that was an input event. Now you have some variables. We talked about a B variable. It's usually some sort of behavior in the aircraft, so it's going to do something in the airplane. You'll also see L variables and H variables. L variables handle behaviors just like B variables do, but devs usually use them in files called XML files. And whether a dev uses an L variable or a B variable, it's up to them. They can accomplish things either way. So that makes it tough for us because when we're trying to find out what changes an instrument or something like that, it can be a lot of different things. H variables are HTML variables, and so they're related for gauges and stuff like that. The next, these ones you will need. You will use these a lot. So we'll use B variables a lot. We'll use L variables a lot. Every once in a while you use H variables. The downside to an H variable is you have to be told it exists. So the developer needs to say, hey, this variable exists, you can use it. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to find, and you can't quickly find it in apps like SpadNext or Axis and O's for H variables. A variables are usually state-based, like what's the speed of the airplane, that kind of stuff. And, you know, they have units with them. L variables can have units also. So, you know, you'll use A variables mostly for reference, like getting information out. one thing that I'll demonstrate later is how to have a checklist where a virtual first officer, tells you something useful when you're at 80 knots. And so you would need to know what your airspeed is in order to do that decision making. And then finally, there are some other variables, E, I, and O, that you'll see, but those are all behind the scenes. We don't interact with them with the apps and stuff. They're for animation and other data related things, but we don't usually use these in. I've never used them in SPAD Next or Access NOs. So these are the kinds of things that we'll be looking for. The next issue is, where do you find them? So let's go back to the sim. You need to turn on dev mode in order to be able to do this. So I'll hit escape. We'll go to settings. On the bottom, there's advanced options. You click that, and then you make sure that you have dev mode turned on, which is up at the top. And once that's on, you will see a new little toolbar at the top of your screen. And the thing that you'll want to do is click under the tools menu. It has a little wrench and a screwdriver icon, and then choose behaviors. And when you do that, this window will pop up, and it'll be one that we're going to dig into quite a bit. So you're going to spend so much time with the behaviors window when you're taking apart an airplane, because it's just where everything happens as it relates to the items in that airplane. So let's go to this panel light knob. So it's a knob that if you scroll your mouse wheel, it goes up and down, making the light brighter and dimmer, and it shows you a percentage, and then turns off when it's at 0%. So we recognize that it has an increase and a decrease. It might even have an animation, although in this case that knob it's not so visible that it animates from this distance. It might have some texture on it that you could look at really close. But so if I want to know what's going on with this panel light knob, I need to have the behaviors window open. I put my mouse over it so it turns blue, and you hit Control G. And then when you do that, the information in here will select, and it chooses panel light knob. Now there are 4 categories of information here. The first one is not too useful for us. It's the animation. It stores like what is the animated state of the thing, and that's because like the rotated texture on there as that knob rotates, and you can see the percentage increase as you spin it around, and that percent in this case would match probably what the value of the light bulb is, because 100% rotated, 100% bright, kind of makes sense. We see an L variable here. The L variable controls that rotation, but it's all related to the animation, not necessarily what the actual brightness of the knob is. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Update codes. Update codes is often the first place I go, because it usually has a simplified view of what the code is. Here we see an O variable, ignore that. E, ignore that. Remember, those are internal variables, not useful for us. You can learn some things, like this is saying if the mouse moves positive, that's the greater than symbol, then do this. And what that means is it says take the value 1 and put it inside of this variable. And if you remember, when we were testing the landing gear, when we set the increase to 1 or 0, it moved the landing gear. So that means that this is useful. This is going to increase the brightness of the panel light. So this is what we're going to look for in Access NOs if we wanted to bind our key to increase the panel light. And then you'll see if the mouse moves in the negative direction, less than 0, then we are decreasing the brightness of the light. So these would be the 2 useful variables for us. Mouse rect, this is related to, again, mouse interactions. This is the new, like, if you click and hold, you can, drag your mouse left and right and change its value. So it has a lot to do with that. And so this gets more complicated because you have wheel up and wheel down. And so you'll see duplication, right? You see panel light increase, decrease, panel light increase, decrease. So they're duplicated. That's because you can scroll your mouse wheel over it, or maybe you grab your mouse and drag. And so this, while it has usually the same info as the update codes, it's usually more complicated because you have these more complicated interactions. Where this can be useful is when you have something that has multiple interactions with it, like a knob that has a push interaction. And so that airspeed knob is not a good one, but something like, um, maybe selected altitude. If I left click on it, see if I right click, it'll synchronize to current altitude. So that's one where it's going to have mouse in, it'll tell us how to synchronize our altitude and what that event might look like. So mouse rec can be handy, but it's usually not the first place I go if I'm just looking for the basic, hey, how do I change this thing? I usually go up to here. But all of that said, these are all variables. Down here is the input events. This is really where you should live because you're guaranteed to get good behavior most of the time if you deal with input events, because that's, you put in an input event and it does something. And if we look here, we can see and expand these. Let's look at what's going on here. So down at the bottom, these are the B variables that were from above. So when we looked at our update code, we see this generic panel light knob increase, and here it is right here. And you can actually test it out. You can, execute that value, and you see how it's 44. If I hit execute again, it goes to 45. So it increases the value of the variable. And you can do that testing right inside the sim to kind of see what happens. So this is where you can catch what I'll call false flag, false B values or B variables that don't really work. Meaning sometimes developers use the B variables for animations, but not actual logic for changing something. And so you'll see a B variable down here and it moves a thing, but it actually doesn't change the value. And so that's where coming back up into update codes is kind of useful. I can give examples of planes like that later. You've got one like the Dirty 30 by Blackbird Simulations. They use a lot of L variables, but then have some B variables for the animations. So these are generally a good place to start because it's just the simplest, it's straightforward. You can test it right here and make sure it does what you want, and then you use those in your binding. But when that doesn't work, coming up here into update codes and finding the exact variable is useful. So let's look at axis and O's and see what we can find from the panel lights. So when you're in axis and O's, I've obviously got a profile loaded for this airplane and it's got a lot of stuff in it. Up here in the scripting menu, there's a few things to do when you're getting into like programming your airplane, and it's the same thing for SPAD Next. First is reading LVARs from the sim. They don't do this by default because there can be literally thousands of LVARs, and it creates stuttering and all that kind of stuff as it's trying to dig through all of these variables and pull them out of the sim. So both Axis and O and SPAD Next, it's a thing that you do. So you said, okay, I'm going to be programming my inputs. Let's read the L variables. So you do that, and it sits for a while and reads all the variables. And then you can program your all your input devices, and you only have to do that if you're doing such a thing, like if you're actually programming your input devices. If you're not doing that, you don't need to read the LVARs because you're just maybe checking to make sure the autopilot master toggle works, and so you can just bring up the profile, hit it, and see if the light lights up. So doing that first, though, if you're going to be doing any instrument programming and things like that, is important. So you do that. After you do that, then generally I would just bounce and start binding things. But let's show you, like sometimes you have to dig through to try and find information. And so let's go to watch simulator variables. This is probably the most popular little tool that I use. When you do that, it brings up this window. It's nice because this window is an always on top window. We're going to select variable, and I'm just going to type the word panel in here, hit enter, and we see all kinds of stuff show up. Let's look at the categories. Native variables. So native variables, those are the, let's see if I can show you here. Those are the K events and stuff like that, and the input events that Microsoft Flight Simulator um, has available to it. So we can look through here, we can see auto feather, audio panels, stuff like that. Down here, we can see the input events, and there's the ones that we want. We can use either the light knob or the IE or the B. So what we're going to do is hold the shift key. This is really useful if you want to save yourself time. Hold shift key, double click, and it'll dump it in to that window. And I'm going to double click on this so I can get the B and the IE. I'm doing this on purpose so you can see the difference of what happens here between these variables and why you would want to target one variable versus another. So those are the input events. Now let's grab some of these ones that were shown in the controls binding. So let's grab this one, and this one. So all three of those panel lights. And now we're going to bounce over to LVARs, and the active AAO variables, this is just currently what do you have that you're paying attention to. So that's what that is. Local simulator variables, this is what's going on in the airplane right now that matches the word panel. Remember, we filtered everything on panel. And so I am going to grab anything starting with an AAO that's internal for Axis and O's. You don't have to worry about it right now. Let's grab generic panel light, lighting panel 1. Maybe let's grab these power settings to see if they're useful. Now, we already know that initial IE and B variable are what we want, but I'm dragging all these in so you can get a sense for how you might have to dig through to find stuff that's useful. And none of these other ones look that interesting as it relates to the panel lights. And then we've already grabbed these two. So we can close this, and now we can see our list of variables. And so then just go back to the sim here and start spinning it. And as you spin it, we see three different things change. We get the panel light knob changes 59, because remember the current brightness is 59%. You'll see that A light panel power setting, that's one of those default key event kind of like, or it's an A variable, but it's got its value, and you'll notice it's slightly different than the other one. And then L variable, generic panel light knob. If you remember, this one was connected to the animation, not necessarily the brightness. And so we'll see, we're going to play with that in a second to see what happens. I'm going to grab this and let's spin it all the way down to 0. And we can see that there's another one that changes, which is this one, whether the light is on or not. Right now it's off, 0. And if I scroll up just a little bit, and then we see it turns on, which is a 1. So we can bounce it between 1 and 0. So you might, if you just wanted to turn the light on and off, you could target this. And then, but the issue is likely that if it's off, then the brightness is 0, so that's not terribly useful. So you'd probably want to have control over the power setting. So now let's see which one of these three do we want to target for our binding. So let's go back to Axis and O's, and we're going to hit the green plus to add a binding. So let's start with the IE. So if I click up here at the top, and I'm going to go to the IEs, and I'll type panel, hit enter, and there it is. And so you can just double click on it, it dumps it in. And so I'll just set it to 1 and we'll see what happens. Let's give that binding a key. So I'll do this here. And all right, so we'll go to button 40 on one of my panels. And I'm going to give this a name with a Z just so we can have it at the bottom. All right, so now there is my binding. I can see it lighting up, but you'll notice that when I activate it, nothing's happening. None of these numbers are changing. And so that means that it's not actually doing anything. So like this IE, when you grab it and just say its value is 1, then it's literally setting the value to 1. So if we come here and I do something like grab this and increase it, we can see the number go up. Now I hit my bind, and let's go back here and hit the bind. Let's see what happens. And it jumps back to 1. So what that's doing is it's just setting the brightness to 1, which isn't terribly useful. So now let's go back to this, and of course, when you click on it, now it wants to load up all the events, and so it's lagging a bit because it's looking at a few thousand events and is jumping to that value. And so you'll see that it's jumping to the LVAR that it manages. All right. So what I'm going to do is let's change it. Let's go to events. We'll go back to panel. And rather than do that, let's grab this B variable that's underneath here, the increase. All right. So now I'm going to do B increase, set it to 1, and bound to that same key that I had before, and now I hit save. So now when I press that, we notice that the number is going up because it's incrementing. So this shows you that not everything you grab, the way you grab it, is going to be useful. You got to be careful about what you grab and also be willing to test it. And I've noticed that with Access NOs, if you hit test, it doesn't always, there it goes. Sometimes it can get kind of laggy when it's interacting between here and the sim, but it started to move there. Anyhow, so that shows you how to use this to get a sense for what variables you could actually grab. Let's play with a couple of these others real quick. So let's go back to here, and I'll show you another way in which you can set values here. So in Access NOs, you can choose what you're going to be modifying, and you can see K, L, B, H, and then RPN. RPN's like code. It's a reverse Polish notation. If you're an old person like me, you might know of a calculator like an HP calculator that was done that way. So RPN allows you to actually use code to do things. So let's do this. Let's say 1 parentheses. I put a space in between here. That space is important. You have to have that space there. Greater than symbol, B, colon, and then it was generic panel light knob, and then increase INC. All right. And then I hit save, and now we test the bind, and you see that it's incrementing. So sometimes I do that a lot. I just go right to the code and just put this in, just because I find that faster when I've found what I want than clicking on it and then having it search through all the values. But having it search through all the values is definitely a way to save yourself from typos. It's just you then end up having to dig through these menus when you're wanting to bind it, rather than just doing it this way. There are some that will find that doing it this way makes the most sense, because we can do like multiple actions on this same little text line. Once you get beyond a couple of things, then this is really unwieldy because it's so small. And I'll show you how to do scripts in a later video. So now we can see that binding that B value was useful. Let's go here and play with the A variable that was there and see if that's useful. And I'm mostly doing this just to show you how things are different between the variables. So in this case, it was light panel power setting. And then there's a comma and a percent. You need a unit with a variables. And so we will then, here, do you see how I've set it to 1? So that means that, as you hopefully would expect at this point, when I hit this bind, it's going to set that value to 1. And let's see here. Did it? Or is it a read-only value? Nope, it didn't actually set it. So a light panel power setting percent. Now, doesn't even, it's not all a variables can be set. Some of them are read only, meaning you can only look at it and not set it, and this might be a read only value. I'm not sure, I didn't check. So but this wouldn't be that useful for increasing the brightness because it just sets the value to 1. And that's where those B variables are so nice, because increment means it increments the value, and so it digs back into the code and then makes the knob move. It makes the the brightness go up, and so using the B variables is the best way to go when you're trying to target events. If they exist, you might have to do L variables instead. And so incrementing something in here is kind of hard. You have to do it with code. So and that'll be for a different video. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of what kind of variables exist in the simulator and how we might dig some of those variables out using axis and O's.